Old blood turn up the heat in Miami Beach on an all-new City Confidential. Next on A&E.
Miami, Florida. A sun-drenched city of sex, surf, and the sinfully rich and famous. People from all over have made their way to South Florida to sample Miami's spices. In the fall of 1961, Don Aronow moved to Miami and invented an industry. Aronow's powerboats were the fastest, sexiest machines on the water, the kind of boat to kill for, and that's exactly what happened.
To think about it was like a movie.
It's a very unique community. The last place you'd expect a boat.
Miami. Florida's sexiest city is a steaming cauldron of culture, concrete, and coastline. A tropical metropolis with attitude to spare. It's like New York with a tan. From the bustling crush of downtown to the boulevards of Little Havana, from the north beaches of Bal Harbor to the hot sands of South Beach, there are few places where the sun shines as bright as Miami. But while Miami may have a big reputation, it's a young city that is still growing.
The population of Dade County is right around 2 million. When you compare that to the likes of like LA County or New York, we're still very small in comparison. I mean, just look around you. There's construction going on everywhere. It's like the city is still being built. And for all practical purposes, it still is.
Miami is a city on the move, literally. The city's frenetic energy can be attributed to its transients. Over the past 60 years, waves of Latin American immigrants of all origins have flooded into the city with the tides.
Miami's a melting pot. We have so many different cultures and so many different ethnicities.
The influx of people not only from Cuba, but from Colombia, from Venezuela, from Buenos Aires, from all over, is pretty intense.
But not to worry. When things get too intense, many Miamians simply hit the beach. While Miami's population boom may be taking up space, there is certainly no shortage of sandy spots in which to kick back and soak up some sun. It's not just the beach that residents love, but what borders it.
The water. I'm a boat nut. I've been in the boat business for 51 years, and I live on a boat in Miami, and my spare time I go boating.
There's a lot of places to boat here. There's a lot of waterways. You can go a lot of different places.
Of course, there are boats. And then there are boats. Both will get you where you need to go, but one will get you there quicker and in true Miami style. Phil Lipschutz has been building, racing, and selling some of South Florida's fastest powerboats for decades.
Miami is considered the powerboat capital of the world. It all started here. But in my years of boating and racing, I have raced all over. The water in Miami, it really lends itself to this type of boating, and it's almost like a lifestyle. And it attracts the players for these type of boats, and this is where it happens.
People from all over the world come to Miami for its salt water and speed.
The Europeans buy the boats and they leave them here with me, and they fly back and forth from Europe. I have great customers all over the world that leave their boats here and because they want to be on Miami Beach. I have a customer that lives in California, in LA, and he leaves his boat here because it's better boating and Miami's hot.
And in red-hot Miami, the coolest boat on the water is a cigarette. It's a brand name that stands as a symbol for the entire powerboat industry.
It's like a Kleenex. Kleenex is a brand of tissue that everybody associates with, so the cigarette, anything that's long and skinny and has loud engines, is a cigarette.
Of course, that's not the case. With an average price tag of about $500,000, cigarettes are in a class by themselves.
Pretty much the pitch.
Bushy eyebrows, and big guy, 218 pounds, and about 6'3", and you know, he was dynamic.
He really struck me as just a really warm guy. You know, I mean, this is a guy that you know, like football players, you bang each other on the butt and, you know, say, go get him, kid.
He was fun. He was really fun. We had a few guys that hung out. Jim Brule and Jake Trotter and myself and Don hung out sometimes on Saturday afternoon and always got into some sort of mischief. We had every kind of activity from shooting pool to picking up women in bars. And he hated to lose.
He also hated sitting still. Very quickly, Don decided to marry his passion for building with his passion for boats.
He liked boats. He didn't know anything about them. And his first effort at so-called boat building, he bought 4 or 5 23-foot hulls from Dave Davis, who owned Seabird boats, and customized them. God, they were disgusting. Really bad. He sold them at a loss.
Those boats were the last things Aronow ever sold at a loss. He may not have known much about boating, but he knew how to find people who did. Aronow quickly assembled a team of the best boat guys in town and launched Formula Marine, custom-made high-performance powerboats.
He got the right people and put the right people together. He surrounded himself with people that really knew what they were doing, and then he could put the package together where he would have the right engine guy, the right rigger, the right guy to do the upholstery, the right guy to make this kind of gauge for him that he needed.
Aronow put his company on 188th Street, a little sun-drenched strip of land along a canal in North Miami. But Don wasn't content to simply build boats. He wanted to race them, and he wanted to win. Offshore powerboating was an emerging sport, a punishing test of a man and his machine. The rules were simple. Go from point A to point B and back. First one to cross the line wins.
It's man against the ocean. And, you know, we didn't have GPS. We didn't have all the new electronics that you have today. It was just, you followed the compass and prayed for relatively calm water so you didn't get the hell beat out of you. So it was a brutal, brutal sport.
You raced in extremely rough waters, and it really didn't matter how fast you went, it's how long you could go fast. The pumps would break for the outdrives, or the engines would break, or you'd break stringers on the boat. And normally back then, the guy that finished the race running with both motors still running, he was usually the guy that won the race.
Within just a few years, the guy who usually won the race was Don Aronow.
He won because he'd take the most punishment in the seas, where he would drive past you in the worst conditions, and he'd smile at you.
He was a complete wild man, so, I mean, you know, the rougher the better, the crazier the better.
In just over a decade, Aronow won 2 world championships, 3 U.S. championships, and set numerous speed records. His was the biggest name in powerboating.
He was probably like, you know, the ultimate movie star, the ultimate Michael.
Buying a company was the easy part. Keeping it profitable was a little harder.
Forget everything else. This guy was a businessman. I mean, he knew basically if he sold the company, the next guy going in didn't have enough materials to even build a hatch for a boat. There wasn't any motors, there wasn't any fiberglass, there wasn't any resin or anything else.
He'd sell them, and then they'd, 6 weeks later, the guy who bought it would come in and say, there's no business here. Aronow would open across the street. And it wasn't the boat name that he was selling in the end, it was Aronow, so the customers would follow him.
By 1975, the little strip of land on 188th Street had become known as Thunderboat Row. Aronow had invented an industry.
That business did not exist before Don got into it, and he ripped him a new one. when he built the Formula Boat Company. And a tremendous number of people who were interested in that came here to get in that business. He did company after company.
Of course, Aronow's innovations weren't limited to the boat shop.
Don was the first guy that really went out to publicize a boat company and himself. And he did a good job of it. He was an excellent, excellent showman.
The problem was, by the 1980s, much of the publicity Don's powerboats were getting was bad. Drug smugglers were using powerboats like taxicabs, making Miami's waterways their own personal expressways.
When Aronow got into boat building in the 60s, his customers were guys in middle-age crises. But by the 70s, criminals were driving the demand for boats.
Motherships, they would come out and dump dozens of bales of marijuana. These guys run out there with these damn boats. They'd go out and pick up $30,000 in a week, in an evening, and just go out and help pick up the bales. These boating guys, see.
You've got a huge shoreline and several inlets and houses on the water and things like this. It was, you know, it was very easy. Your odds were like, you know, way stacked up there for you to succeed, so.
Fast boats were the vehicle of choice for drug smugglers, and nobody made faster boats than Don Aronow.
In our industry, everybody pretty much knew what everybody was doing, but Don didn't ask questions, and people wanted to buy a boat. Hey, you bring me the money, and, you know, you take the boat.
He knew the waterfront, and he had all kinds of guys like insiders could tell him what was going on. But he didn't figure, I'm not trying to think for Don, but I don't think he figured it was his job to be a policeman.
U.S. Customs was getting pretty tired of being outrun by drug runners in Aronow-built boats, so they decided to get their own. In 1984, Don Aronow was running his latest company, a small outfit called USA Racing, when he got a call from an old friend, then Vice President George Bush.
Bush asked his friend Aronow, who he already bought a boat or two from in the past, would he be interested in building a patrol boat for U.S. Customs to catch dopers. The boat was called Blue Thunder, and Bush even staged a photo op on a prototype riding on it with Aronow. So now Aronow is building police boats to catch smugglers in boats he'd sold earlier.
It's probably one of the best interdiction boats in the world. I mean, you see pictures of them in there with bales of marijuana and stuff like that, all of them.
The first Blue Thunder boat was delivered from USA Racing in 1985. Customs liked it so much, they ordered 12 more. USA Racing was soon another one of Aronow's successes. Word of the new contract got around quick and eventually made its way to Benjamin Barry Kramer. Kramer was a drug smuggler with a penchant for boat building who had grown up around Miami's marinas, idolizing Aronow.
He wanted to be the next Don Aronow. And as far as Ben goes, I mean, he just came on like a flash. I mean, it's everything I can remember. I mean, I raced since 1965, and these guys would come in on a flash. You know, all of a sudden they show up. You know, you'd hear about them. You know that they were buying the engines from the same people we were buying from, and you know, modeling themselves after our stuff. And you know, then they'd be on the circuit.
Kramer didn't have the same style as Don, but the accomplishments he tried to model himself on. So he was racing boats. He wanted to be the world champion, but he needed money to be like Don.
And money was one thing Kramer did have. As a kid, Kramer had made the classic Miami connection on how to make quick cash.
He's hanging around Miami and sees all these boats, and he makes the connection. Boats, pot. He was still high school age, but he'd made enough money from selling reefer by the joint to buy a secondhand cigarette. So he's picking pot up in the water and bringing it in the last mile. He's eventually caught and went to prison for 4 years. But it was more like going to college. he made the best Colombian connections. And when he gets out, instead of doing a ton of pot at a time, now he's doing 75 tons.
But while Ben Kramer may have wanted to be like Don, the last thing he wanted was to be beaten by him. Kramer figured that Don Aronow making boats for customs could be very bad for his smuggling business. So he decided to do something about it. But when the two men finally came to terms, one of them got much more than he'd bargained for. City Confidential on A&E. Miami has always been a favorite spot for the jet set. Fast cars, fast boats, and even faster women make Miami a magnet for those who like to live on the razor's edge. And in Miami in the late 80s, the epicenter for fast times was 188th Street, Thunderboat Row, where Don Aronow was the undisputed king. Women loved him. Men wanted to be him, and everybody wanted a piece of the legend, especially drug smuggler and sometimes boat racer Ben Kramer. But Kramer had more reasons for wanting a piece of the Aronow dynasty than just Don envy. Aronow's USA Racing had garnered a contract to make Blue Thunder boats for U.S. Customs, boats that could seriously interfere with Kramer's smuggling operations. So Kramer decided to kill two birds with one stone and buy USA Racing. And Don, being Don, was only too happy to sell.
So now, Kramer owns the Blue Thunder contract to make boats for the U.S. Customs to catch smugglers. Why would Aronow sell his company with a Blue Thunder contract in the newspapers to a Colombian-connected, under investigation, punk pot dealer?
Kramer thought he'd scored big. Not only was he walking in the footsteps of the king, but he now had control over the boats that would be chasing his. Too bad for Kramer. U.S. Customs had other ideas.
The United States government said, Ben Kramer, we do not do business with Ben Kramer. We do not do business with a convicted felon, a convicted drug smuggler. That contract is null and void. So he sold the business back to Don. And of course, Don beat him. There was a loss involved.
But that was nothing new. There always seemed to be a loss involved when doing business with Don Aronow. Don went back to building the Blue Thunder boats for customs, and Kramer went about his business, legitimate and otherwise. On February 3rd, 1987, Don was back on Thunderboat Road checking in on the Blue Thunder production and putting together plans for a return to racing. It was the kind of winter day South Florida is famous for. Blue skies and warm temperatures. A perfect day for fishing on Newport Pier, running the boat in the Intercoastal, or just laying around the beach soaking up the sun. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, Don decided to call it a day.
Mr. Aronow pulled out of the driveway of Apache Powerboats. He had met there with some people and was there for a short period of time. After he left, he pulled out onto the roadway, and the stories are very consistent from this point, and that is that he proceeded in a westerly direction. The town car pulled up side by side with him from a westerly direction. They were driver's window to driver's window.
And then, bam, bam, turned 5 shots, 6 shots, 5 hit him. And then the black Lincoln scoots around him and goes out and escapes the only exit toward Biscayne Boulevard.
Word of the shooting spread through Thunderboat Row.
I was in the restaurant at Fort Apache. There was a marina right down the street from the Aronow factory. And we were in the restaurant and heard a big commotion, and somebody was screaming and hollering. We walked out of the restaurant. I remember it was shortly, I think Cigarette closes, the shift gets off around 3 or 3:30. They closed the street so nobody could leave, and it was a pretty sad day.
By the time police arrived, the street was crowded with people. Don Aronow was dead, slumped over in his Mercedes on the very street that he had built.
It was pretty chaotic, actually, because that area back there there's only one way in and one way out. And in the middle of the afternoon, there's a lot of people up there. So you really want to take great care in preserving the scene and keeping it as pristine as possible. And then, of course, you need to isolate witnesses. You have to find out what happened, who saw it, what they saw, and try to start to develop suspects.
As police began their investigation, they quickly discovered there was certainly no shortage of suspects.
The list was very long and distinguished. People who Don had beaten in business, or smuggling, because there were rumors that on 188th Street that some of the docks were rented out overnight so there could be unloading going on, or maybe because Aronow was building enforcement boats to catch smuggling boats that he'd earlier sold. Tons of possibilities, too many. The cops didn't know where to start.
As police tried to piece together the evidence, the media had a field day with the story.
It was huge news. It was on the front page of the paper. It was on the lead story on national news. It was a big story. I mean, he was a very well-liked man, and he worked with a lot of important people and had a lot of influential customers.
There was an avalanche of press. It was all over TV, all over the newspapers, national news. It was, how could someone who was a great sportsman and had a great image in the public, every newspaper man and magazine person loved him, and his customers loved him. Why? This was Miami Vice, and here's a beloved person being assassinated. It was right off the show.
But soon, the newspapers would be reporting more than just murder, as allegations would begin to surface. Allegations of dirty deals, double crosses, and an ego big enough to kill. City confidential.
Of crime scene. Most of the witnesses said they saw a Lincoln, but one saw a Mercedes. Half said the car was black, the other half said it was dark blue. One said 2 people in the car, the rest said 1.
Miami in the 1980s was murder central. Cocaine cowboys shot it out in the streets, and attacks on tourists were in the news almost daily. The streets were not safe, not even Thunderbolt Row. On February 3rd, 1987, Powerboat legend Don Aronow had been shot and killed in broad daylight. And months into the investigation, police had a suspect list longer than the lines in front of South Beach clubs. Word on 188th Street was Aronow had been whacked by the jilted lover of one of his many mistresses. Or more likely, that Aronow had been hit by drug smugglers with whom he was secretly in business. But the cops weren't buying any of it.
There was a lot of BS about his possibly even being involved in the smuggling business. Don Aronow didn't have to be involved in the smuggling business. It certainly wasn't necessary. He had the power and the money that it would be stupid. And Don Aronow was not a stupid man.
The cops didn't have much. Some shell casings, a description of the shooter's car, and a few eyewitnesses for what they were worth.
It was a classic example of problems of identification at a crime scene. Most of the witnesses said they saw a Lincoln, but one saw a Mercedes. Half said the car was black, the other half said it was dark blue. One said 2 people in the car, the rest said 1 person in the car.
Between the shady recollections of the eyewitnesses and the ever-expanding suspect list, 2 years after Aronow's shooting, the case was going nowhere.
We were going in so many different directions we couldn't see straight. You know, we investigated a whole lot of things, a whole lot of people. We went in numerous directions as far as the investigation was. And in 1987, 1988, we were probably no closer than we were on February 3rd.
But as police hung around Thunderboat Row, they heard rumors that maybe there was more to the botched USA racing deal with Ben Kramer than was originally thought.
There's a rumor out there that maybe Aronow only refunded the contract price and not the $1 million or so that Kramer supposedly paid him in cash in addition.
The guy says, well, give me my money back, and this is only my understanding, is that Don, I know Don, he said, the hell with you, you know, this is dirty money, and you don't need it, you got enough, it's mine now.
In February of 1989, 2 years into the investigation, police also received a little piece of information that the feds had simply been withholding. Don Aronow was killed the day before he was set to testify against Ben Kramer on federal racketeering and money laundering charges.
Don was in a position to testify against him for the purchase of USA Racing, because, of course, Ben Kramer's money was ill-gotten, and the money used to purchase the business was drug money, laundered money.
It wasn't until the feds tell the Metro-Dade homicide cops that Aronow was supposed to testify against Kramer to grand jury, where they really make the connection that maybe we better look at Kramer a lot closer.
But even with the new information, half of which was rumor anyway, investigators had nothing solid on Kramer.
Ben Kramer developed as a suspect very early on, within probably hours. But again, there was no evidence, or there was nothing to support his being involved in this. So he was just in the file.
Now, nearly 3 years after Aronow's murder, investigators had little more than they'd started with. Then one day, the phone rang.
In 1989, we got the file. Of course, we knew that from our ballistics evidence. But we never released the brand name of the gun. It was a pretty obscure brand. It was called a Star 45. Ultimately, we came up with an individual that provided Bobby with a Star 45 caliber semi-automatic handgun within a week of the murder.
Police picked up Bobby Young.
Young admits the shooting, but doesn't admit any connection to Kramer or anybody else, because Bobby's a guy who doesn't like to rat.
The Miami cops had their trigger man, but what they really wanted was to be able to pin the murder on the man who'd paid for the hit, to put drug smuggling, money laundering, murdering Ben Kramer behind bars for good. But when they went looking for him, they found out someone had beaten them to it. City Confidential will return on A&E. Confidential on A&E. In February of 1989, Miami police were hot on the trail of Ben Kramer, the man who they suspected had commissioned the hit on Powerboat king Don Aronow. More than 3 years after Aronow's death, police nabbed the triggerman, Bobby Young. The problem was, while they knew there was a connection, police couldn't prove that Kramer had paid Young to make the hit. What they needed was evidence that linked Kramer to Young. Evidence that could put Kramer behind bars for good. The catch was, Kramer was already in jail. In 1988, the feds, who had been investigating Kramer's drug smuggling operation for years, finally nailed him. Kramer, who at one time had been one of America's most prolific drug smugglers, was now a resident in one of America's most notorious prisons, Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary.
Kramer's in jail for federal charges for money pleas. He says it's a plea of convenience because by this time he's already in federal prison for smuggling and money laundering, and he has nothing to gain by winning a murder trial.
Although Aronow's death had been a cold, calculated, premeditated, mob-style hit, for many, Kramer and Young's manslaughter convictions didn't seem